Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Kennan Institute Global Fellow Peter Zwack. Peter is a former U.S. Army Brigadier General who served in Moscow as the U.S. Senior Defense Official and Attaché to the Russian Federation. He joins us to discuss the latest from the battlefield in Ukraine. General Zwack, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Always good to be working with Wilson Center.
It's fantastic to have you working with us as well, sir. So one thing I was wondering, and I'm sure you can answer this question, is as I look at the official statements from the Ukrainian government, from the Russian government, look at media in both countries, look at global media, my question is, how much certainty do we have in what we actually know is happening on the battlefield?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, you're always going to get fog of war. And at the very, very tactile level, on the ground level, we can learn by the imagery and drones and all that. But there's something that goes on the ground that will only come up from the soldiers and those actually involved in the fighting. You could call it anecdotal. That's where you have your war correspondents and things like that. And it's that visceral blood and grit aspect of it that is the most hard to determine in what you would call broad standoff reporting, meaning what's going on right now along the battlefront. I think one of the Ukrainian, their intent in part, as judging from their experiences outside Kyiv last, in February, March of 2022, and Kharkiv, is how will Russian forces melt down in a specific unit start to break. And that's hard to measure technically. You might hear it through intercepts, but that comes from, troops that are surrendering and troops that are disobeying their officers and all of that. That's the hard part to determine and ascertain. And I think one of the Ukrainian, if you will, tactics or strategies is continue to, just like a terrier, just bite and grab on, and then work where they can, a breakthrough site, but just wear the Russians down to the point where the Russian troops there, they're fighting hard now too, but they're fighting A, for their lives, and B, for their foxhole buddies, but they're not fighting for the cause. They really don't believe, they don't have the will to fight. That's the difference between the Ukrainians, I believe, and the Russians right now, is as ugly as it's been. And it's been awful for the Ukrainians too. Terrible losses. But they're in, they're all in as a nation and societally. And how we work that to get that battlefield feel, oh my God, the Russians seem to be melting here. This is where we're going to push, and let's see what happens, as occurred last summer.
That human motivation factor, that individual motivation of how much passion you feel for the actual cause, or in the case of the Russian soldiers, maybe just the assignment, as you said, no cause involved. From the perspective of military commanders, how much does that make a difference? How much of an advantage is that viewed as?
Well, I think it's huge when properly marshaled and with the resources that can leverage it. And that's huge in both offense, but also in defense. The Ukrainians, they finally had to pull back, but put up a hell of a fight for Bakhmut for 8 months. And then finally the grind, became unacceptable, and they pulled back to more defensible lines. So, and belief in your leadership, and it could be in a corporation, it could be, in an academic setting. If you believe in your leadership, you're going to fight harder. And we're all hearing that on the Russian side, the Russian troops, junior officers, look suspect at their middle to senior level leadership, who have not done a good job presiding in this war. Now, on the Ukrainian side, it seems that the leaders seem to just have more battlefield presence, saying that we see far more about what is going on the Ukrainian side because it is so much more covered, where there is a relative veil of silence officially on the Russian troop lines, though the Russians also have their social media and things to get on. But I think that's what the Ukrainians in part are, a large part is, I don't want to say who breaks first, because I think that how the Russians break would be different than the Ukrainians break. If the Russians break, they will melt down en masse. And at what point do the Ukrainians feel just combat fatigue, and this just can't go on this way anymore, and at that point start thinking about a negotiation that nobody wants on the Ukrainian side. I was just there. Nobody. This is a societal fight on the Ukrainian side, and nobody right now has the stomach for negotiation with the Russians.
The short-lived Wagner rebellion and now the death and possible assassination of Prigozhin, has that had a measurable impact that we can detect at this point on Russian troops?
I think that it's again what we don't see, but this had. I mean, let's just think about it, John. You had Prigozhin, who already was just casting loudly and publicly disparaging thoughts about Russian military leadership at the senior level. That was getting out. And then the regime decided that we're going to put Wagner, we're going to get a handle on Wagner and somewhat muffle Prigozhin by pulling in the Wagner troops under the Ministry of Defense and all that. And a whole confluence of issues, whatever the reason, the spark, Prigozhin leads this pell-mell, extraordinary, unbelievable. This is stuff of fiction is made, push halfway to Moscow, but on the way stops at the Southern Military District headquarters, and I've been there for a negotiation in Rostov. That's a pretty serious place, and it got pictures of him talking to Russian active officers, including generals. And we saw the imagery, even in Russia, of Russians. I think most of them were watching, almost bemused, but there were a lot of them that were supporting and cheering. And this, I think, for the Putin regime was scary, because if this is the Russian military is not putting up much of a fight to this group that's moving on towards Moscow, basically being waved through the Wagner troops, waved through these positions, and the people on the street seemingly in support, this is scary to an authoritarian regime, with a firebrand of a leader that has now gone directly anti-regime, though he's saying it was against the Russian Ministry of Defense and the army head. No, that was extraordinary. And I think that Putin had to ultimately, this broke whatever tolerance he had for Prigozhin. They make their deal from hell. And God knows what the backstory ultimately is on that. And then Prigozhin for another 2 months. We all thought he was going to quietly go away to Belarus and all that, is visible in Russia, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Belarus, anecdotally in Africa. And I think at a certain point, Putin has already looked at Prigozhin as disloyal and has betrayed him like a mafia crime boss. And I think at a certain point, the decision was made, we're going to make him go away. And then they waited for the moment, and the moment became the 2-month anniversary of the mutiny. And we know the rest of the story, though the murky part, we don't know exactly what happened, but the, you know, and there's conspiracy theories abounding which is Russia, which is Byzantine, it always is, but it looks like he's really gone. But
So
the legacy, John, the legacy is that, you know, the Russian military and population has seen this play out. And that just doesn't magically go away when he goes away. That's there now. And I think that, and by the way, I think Prigozhin may have had political aspirations. He'd become a bit of a rock star, a little bit of a cult of personality. I'm stretching it a bit, but in March 2024, ostensibly the Russian presidential elections, though many of us think that will ultimately be annulled because they're in a, you know, they're not in a war. Remember, they're in a special military operation. Right. But back to you. I'm sorry, I get carried away.
No, that's okay. I wanted to ask you, you know, Ukrainian leaders from President Zelensky on down have, their message has been consistent. They've expressed gratitude to the West, but they've also continued to beat the drum that they need more support. What specifically do they need in terms of armaments or reinforcements? What do they need specifically? And is NATO willing to up the ante?
I think they need more than else. And I was with an NGO, a delegation, Renew Democracy Initiative, about 10 weeks ago in Ukraine, close to a week. And we saw a lot of things. The fact that the whole society is supportive of this struggle, this existential struggle. Nobody wanted to negotiate with the Russians. And they were talking about after the victory, we will, which is very important because they're moving past surviving. They're talking about winning. But I think more than anything, they need weapons. They need more weapons. They need bigger weapons and all that. But I'll come back to that. But what they want to know more than anything else is, will their friends and partners, led by the United States, stick with them in event that the counteroffensive did not go as well as they had hoped? Because we were there when all the discussion and planning for the counteroffensive, it was imminent, but it was more, it was that worry. Will you be with us to the end on this? And of course, they're watching the funding and our own politics and everything else. And then with that knowledge, that will keep them even more so in the fight. But yes, getting at your question, I think we've seen enough to know and seen enough of Russian standoff viciousness over almost 19 months. Can you believe it? Yes, I think the Ukrainians have earned and shown they should have longer range missiles that we all hear about, these ATACMS, these rockets that work off of the HIMARS chassis. The F-16s look to be coming. Our tanks are coming. They're all force multipliers. Won't totally, completely change the nature of the war, but being all in and then talking about putting constant pressure on the Russians, what breaks? So they need the assurance that we in the West, not just the United States, but what I call a free-minded world, stays with them in a war, in a struggle, an existential struggle that our Western civilization has not seen since the late 1930s and World War II.
So Ukrainians aren't the only ones looking for support. As you and I record this interview, Kim Jong-un has arrived in Russia, and in the next day or two will be meeting with Vladimir Putin. What are the Russians looking for, and can the North Koreans provide them with military support?
Well, I would ask this question also to a lot of your great scholars at Ken and Wilson. the Russian people, I would say, want to be, they want to believe in their nation. They want to believe in the actions and the narrative. And they're not totally cut off from the world. But I think a lot of Russian citizens, especially if the word gets out, or the Russian citizens are asked, do you really think it's in your nation's best interests, your people's best interests, the image of your great nation, best interest, to be deeply consorting with the #1 pariah nation in the world? And then with Iran coming in, fairly significant second. And I find it extraordinary. And I think that this message that Putin going to, Kim Jong-un going to Vladivostok is almost and Putin meeting him is almost being a supplicant, Russia, they're asking or trying to work an arms deal where weapons that were probably provided by the Soviets and then the Russians, they're now trying to get back, which is remarkable. But if I'm a Russian that is fairly informed, I get it. We've got to do all we can, but are these our allies? Are these the people we really want to be associated with? As as Putin tries to make this, a existential fight, if you will, for Russia's survival. But that, I don't know, can play forever. And for Kim Jong-un, it gives him leverage. And he's looking for weapons. He's looking for satellite, technology, satellite-assisted capabilities. Talking about upgrading their submarines, or so-called nuclear submarine. It's not good. How does the United Nations really think? You've got countries that are fence-sitters with the Russians. The Russians go in deep with the North Koreans. Even those fence-sitters are saying, I don't know, that's a hard one to manage. But it's transactional. It gives Kim Jong-un a stage. China playing both sides of it. Can't be comfortable anytime the Russians are consorting with the North Koreans. The Chinese will kind of pretend to cast a blind eye, but they don't like it.
Yeah.
And
I can't. I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
No, keep going.
No, okay. I want to ask you. We can't ignore the ongoing low-level and sometimes even crazier rhetoric around the possible use of nuclear weapons that we've heard from various Russian officials. How concerned should we be? And as military planners look at the scenario, of course, you have to take that threat seriously, but on a scale of probability, is there a serious concern that Russia will go there?
I would go back, because there's been a lot of criticism with our actions early on in the war. Why didn't we send more stuff, big stuff, sooner? You are where you are when you were. And if we all remember, in late February and March, you had a nuclear, not power, but superpower that has just committed an act of aggression of the scale that the West hasn't seen since the Nazi Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. And the rhetoric was there. The Ukrainians were in the early moments of really putting this valiant, epic defense together. And I think we and the West, and it isn't just the United States, we're careful. I mean, provided a lot of support to Ukraine, but you're dealing with a a nuclear power, mastodon. So and over time, we remember red lines. The Russians were thumping and using what I call, nuclear extortion, where if you do this, you cross this line, we have options, and then you had Dmitry Medvedev, who we once saw as reasonable, being basically Putin's mouthpiece about nukes in a way that Putin could kind of suggest, but let him do the talking. But it made the world really uneasy. But the more we push, or the Ukrainians pushed, we finally did send major weapons like HIMARS, and there are going to be consequences. Or when the Ukrainians pushed into Luhansk and Donetsk and in the southeast, annexed lands that are now forever in the Russian embrace. These four Ukrainian regions that the Russians annexed, of course, on top of Crimea in 2014. And I was there for that. And the Russians squawked, but didn't do anything along that line. I think there's a lot of back channel going on messaging that we don't know. But to get at your base point, if you were a president of a nation, whether our own or capitals or nuclear tipped capitals like in London and Paris, you take that, you owe it to your citizens to take it seriously, but to the point where it does not incapacitate your ability to act or to react. And that is what's happened in the last year. But we still are being careful and will always have to be careful. But also with its nuclear bluffs, it's also put the world on notice, including China and India, that kind of like to try to play it rhetorically in Russia's favor. They don't want to see any part of that. So that dog don't hunt type of thing. But the capability is there, always there for accident, incident, provocation. We've had Reapers knocked down. We've had brushes by our aircraft. Things can happen that could put us on a nuclear trajectory really fast. So it's still incredibly dangerous. And the arms control regimen is gone. New START is gone. And, maybe they'll resuscitate it. Everything else is gone. INF, ABM, all of that going back. So there's no cartilage between us and the Russians on nuclear issues. I know that they still have a hotline and all of that, but it's scary. And how do you, in a cyber fast environment, start doing decision making or reaction in a nuclear potential environment? So it's very dangerous. And the last thing on the nukes, one of the things about the nuclear arms, think about it. We had these treaties done in the heart of the Cold War. They didn't all come at the end of the Gorbachev. I mean, early on. I mean, you had Nixon, Brezhnev, and all of that going on. So it's still dangerous. We want to get back with the Russians in some type of credible discussion, negotiation. But there's China that is now rapidly building its nuclear access capabilities with no checks and balances or dialogue. So it is scary. I'm sad that our kids have to worry about this. We thought that we'd gotten past it. That's why I tell youth, go out and see Oppenheimer, because that's a true story. Mm-hmm. Imagine, we never want to go back to that time again. Finally, I'm sorry, this is
no, it's an important question.
Is passionate to me. We do need to find a way to come back to nuclear dialogue because there is, again, so little tissue between us, and things could break in a moment. though nobody, including the Russians, want to go to nuclear war.
You brought up
last point on this, the
yes.
in-between thing here, and that's why there are a number of us that worry that a way to finesse the point and spook everybody is have something really bad happen around the Zaporizhia nuclear power station.
Mm-hmm.
And there you get your nuke. You can claim disassociation from it, and it creates the narrative and the fear and all of that.
Yeah, but that nuclear cloud could, if the winds blow toward Russia, that could be a problem for them as well. You mentioned Oppenheimer, General Zwack. I should tell our viewers who might be interested, next week on this program, our guest will be Kai Bird, one of the co-authors of the book American Prometheus, on which the Oppenheimer film was inspired and based. So not to do a little commercial in the midst of a very serious discussion, but
let me add to that. Can you imagine what they were dealing with? You know, they were dealing with truly, what hath we wrought?
Yeah.
And there was a tiny percentage chance, and there's a great moment in film without giving much away, when it comes out that theoretically, the scientists were worried they could blow up the whole atmosphere. Talk about the pressure on those people. But you were dealing at that time with an existential foe in the Nazis. And then they surrender, but it all begins, the Manhattan Project, with the Nazis. They're in a dead heat race, and the Nazis have the edge.
They have the head start. Yeah. Okay. So I have a final question for now, because obviously this is not going to end quickly. And it's about timelines. You know, the Russians badly miscalculated. They thought this was going to be a bit of a cakewalk to Kyiv. Here we are in year 2 and counting. And from the military planning perspective, General Zwack, do you allow yourselves to think in terms of a timeline, or is it one day at a time?
That's a great question, because your reality is you're fighting on the front. You're fighting a day at a time, and you're trying to, the Ukrainians, you're trying to do the right thing. You're trying to fight. You're trying to win. You're trying to survive. And I gotta believe whether Ukraine or in the Somme in 1916 and other seemingly internal fights, I don't think anybody knew what a timeline would be. But I think the Ukrainians are trying to keep the pressure on. I think they realize the longer this goes, the more the Russians have an ability to continue to bulk up. Saying that, we say, time isn't on the Ukrainian side if this continues. If they have support, I don't necessarily agree, because I will say also, the longer this goes on, and the Ukrainians, and Russians have themselves in a scorpion dance in many ways, the longer this goes, the more stress on the Putin regime. And that's the part when we talk about end state. We don't know what the snapping point are. And traditionally, authoritarians under pressure, major pressure, we've seen them snap. And we have to remind ourselves, Russia snapped not once, but twice viciously in the last century in 1917, and then 88, 89, 90, 91. So this is going to go on. I think the Ukrainian mind is stay in the fight, exact a toll, let all the other issues play out around the world economically and all that. I will tell you, I think I and many others believe absolutely strategically, Putin is buying time. He's hoping, I'll just say it this way, he's hoping for a Republican win in the United States in 2024. I don't think that's a surprise. He will have his own election in March of 2024 that some of us believe may be annulled because they're in that bad word, war. But so time on the ground, the best thing we can do is I go right back to where I started. The Ukrainians are in this fight. And I, by the way, I have to make this point, and those that know me, I'm not fundamentally deeply anti-Russian. I'm an old Cold Warrior, but I have a long history with Kennan out and among the Russians, trying to work eyes wide open bridges and appreciate the culture. But this regime, in my mind, is so rogue that the Ukrainians are the recipient, that they're going to hang in there as long as we support them. And then the last thing, who could have imagined, John, when you're looking at a long war, these type of things, alliances, who could have imagined traditionally peaceful, neutral Sweden and Finland deciding, all right, we've seen enough. There's no splitting hairs on this. We want to be in NATO and support Ukraine. And I think that's critical. Another piece in the long war is ultimately what happens with countries like India and China that right now are playing it both ways. China, I believe, unfortunately, for its regime and how it looks at the big world, the worst thing that could happen for China is if Russia were to really fail and bottom out. That would be bad for China in its geostrategic view. I don't know how it will end. The best that we can do is just be sure, as long as the Ukrainians are putting up a good fight and and stay within the bounds of Geneva Convention and all that, and the Russians continue with this viciousness that goes beyond the pale of anything that we've seen, we're going to have to say, I don't know when it's going to end. But I think that pulling out on them, I'll leave with this last point, leads us to the philosophical question. If we in the West, who ostensibly are philosophically closest to what Ukraine wants to be and is, who are we? What are we? If we, because of money and all that, and it's expensive and it's ugly, we pull out on them and allow the sort of the authoritarian, the authoritarians win. And then we're, in my mind, in 1939 psychologically.
On that somber note, I want to thank you, General Zwack, for the experience and the insight you bring to this discussion is invaluable to our understanding. So thank you for spending time with us today.
Hey, thank you for having me. You guys are great.
Fantastic. And we hope to talk to you again.
Cheers.
General Zwack, thank you. Thanks to our viewers as well. Hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for your time and interest.